Great. Welcome everyone to All the Single Men. What if the Bennet sisters were the Bennet brothers? So welcome everyone. This is a segment for the virtual Jane Con, where we're going to be talking about what if the Bennet sisters of Pride and Prejudice were five brothers instead of five sisters, and what that changes about the story, how the characters as we know them are reflected in and or changed if they are young men instead of young women. And we're going to have some fun with this. We're going to do this in a sort of podcasty style rather than a scholarly video here. So with that, we will get started. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Erin Page. I'm a writer. I'm a marketing professional and technical writer by day and a fiction writer by night. Lifelong fan of historical fiction and classic lit. I've been reading Jane Austen since I think probably middle school, but definitely high school. And Pride and Prejudice is a great favorite of mine.
Hi, I'm Margaret Beaufort, and I'm a journalist and communications specialist professionally. And I deal with all things related to anywhere from real estate to education to kind of, international exchange and culture. And I'm also a constant reader. I read a lot of historical nonfiction, but I, of course, love fiction as well, and the classics, as well as historical fiction.
And the way that we're going to structure this too is I've kind of like set up some sort of like, as the fiction writer, I've set up some premises, and Margaret's going to kind of react to them as we go.
Ruin all of them.
And again, this is for fun. This is exploring a little bit of the historical reality of that time period and the time that Jane Austen was writing and that Pride and Prejudice is set in, but also a little bit of fun with like the characters of the five sisters, now the five brothers, and what we think they would do as brothers, and how the other family members would react to them. So my thesis generally is it does change the plot a whole bunch. I think that the characters I think hopefully largely stay the same, because that's the goal here, is like how does like the setting around them change, I think, with their gender change, but I think it will change the plot a lot, so we'll see as we go. So I do want to sort of do like a little bit of a level set, and I'm going to use the phrase gender swapping, which comes from literary convention and fiction convention. This is not looking at different terminologies for that. It's just the literary convention of like, oh, what if this character who is female here was actually just a male character? So I wanted to level set that as well. All right, without further ado, we're going to start with Jane Bennet, who is now John Bennet. She's the eldest brother of the Bennet family. And what do we know about the Bennet family is that it is entailed to the male line. And that is a huge plot point in Pride and Prejudice, because none of the five daughters of Mr. Bennet can inherit Longbourn and the estate that is his family. And so this is something that you could do in English law at the time. They also note in Pride and Prejudice that they have to keep that Jane and Elizabeth keep explaining it to Mrs. Bennet, and she refuses to listen, and is just like, I just can't understand how this is happening to us. And so I think that is like, even back then, people were like, this is absurd. Like, people would be like, I'm up in arms. Like, this is impossible. So if you take that away, that's a huge plot point that is very different for the Bennet brothers. So now John Bennet is going to inherit, and we don't have Mr. Collins maybe at all. Because the whole reason he comes in is because he's the next male heir for the Bennet family. And he is Mr. Bennet's cousin, which makes him the second cousin minimum for the daughters. So the concept of them possibly marrying him, which is a huge plot point in the novel Pride and Prejudice, would not have been untoward. Like, people could marry, like, and think today you could marry a second cousin or a third cousin.
You
But it's not
could,
someone
people
who's
just
like,
don't like it.
it's even back then people were like, do we have to? Let's
Yeah.
but I think that's like another thing too, is I think people are like, yeah, people used to always marry their cousins. And it's like, no, like I mean they did, but like a lot of people still were like, ew, I don't want to. Like, no, like, and it wasn't as common as people who were not related to one another like getting married.
Yeah.
So I did have this idea too, and I'm not gonna like dive into it, but like what if Mr. Collins was like Miss Collins? Like, and she was like this kooky cousin who came in. Like,
Yeah. And like
in,
the idea would be different because if John Bennet is inheriting Longbourn, um, Miss Collins is coming in also trying to find a husband, being like, this is my only hope because I am not inheriting anything. Miss Collins has nothing to inherit, whereas Mr. Collins did.
Mhm.
And so like I feel like it makes it kind of sadder if you when you make it Miss Collins coming in. But yeah, it would be like a kooky female cousin being like, hey, anyone want to marry me?
Yeah. It could be like, I wonder because Mr. Collins he's very like, he's kind of confident in himself. And um he's also like good at in some ways he's good at reading Catherine de Bourgh at Lady de Bourgh, and being the kind of person that she wants to have around her. So if you don't have a lot of money yourself, but you're good at ingratiating yourself to the wealthy people, he might be good at like, or she might be good at
Yeah.
and maybe, if Catherine de Bourgh had a son instead of a daughter, like, um
True.
finagling her way into that family. But we've got John Bennet, and he's inheriting Longbourn, their family house that they live at. What is he getting out of that? What's he going to have to offer himself and the potential wife? The Bennets are in the lower echelon of the landed gentry in England, and I think that is something too. It's because I remember like getting a lot of instruction on this in class when we first read it back in the day, because they're like, this is a historic concept that you need to understand the context of their society, because it's so different from anything anyone has today, even like in England, um that they are still wealthy people, like on like the grander scale of things. They own a house, they have an estate that they're with money that they're entitled to annually. And they have people who pay like money to them who live on that estate that they don't, which they also, Jane Austen doesn't talk about those parts and those people in her books for the most part. Like she'll mention them. She mentions them, I would say maybe the most in Emma, where she talks about either like she mentions a couple servants, and then she also mentions like Mr. Martin and a couple other farmers who live and work on the lands that the wealthier characters live on. But I think that is something too, is like Mrs. Bennet and other people are acting like, and Catherine de Bourgh is an example, act like the Bennets are so poor. And
Yeah.
it's like they're poor in comparison to other rich people.
Right.
But they have this like nice house that they live in.
And it might be like not all, obviously, but at the time period, I feel like a lot of the literature was very focused. And even today in historical fiction, um, a lot of it focuses on the wealthier people. So the Bennets are kind of poorer, but in the grand scheme of the actual population, no, they are not
Yeah.
poor.
Yeah,
Um,
so that's like the background. And I think that's part of also what makes it comedic too, is because it's like they're acting like they're so stressed about things. And it's like, you got like a lot going for you.
yeah. Like you guys are getting in the room with very wealthy people. There are a
Yeah,
lot of people not getting in that room.
yeah. um it would not be an estate that is particularly attractive to the level that Mr. Bingley's or Mr. Darcy's estates are. So especially like if John Bennet is becoming friends with Mr. Bingley, who just moved to the neighbor, they're going, maybe they're having a shooting party or something like that. They're going into town and like having dinner somewhere together, and they're becoming friends. They Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy are being, as they are from the very first page of Pride and Prejudice, being targeted by the eligible women and their mom. So it still is like, you would still be, if you're marrying John Bennet, you're getting a house, you're getting land, you're getting the money that you're entitled to all the time. But the estate is not like luxurious. And they're going to be doing some work too. So I was trying to think of like, where do I think, like, based on Jane's character in the novel, what kind of person is John Bennet? What is he doing? And if you look at one of the earliest descriptions of Jane, they say she has pleasing manners and goodwill, like, and that kind of holds throughout the book. She's very much a people pleaser, and if we're keeping him the same, I think he goes like, his dad is just a landowner and is managing the estate. So I think he would be doing the same. I did want to examine, like, do we think John Bennet gets married? Because some people didn't. You didn't have to. You didn't have to get married.
But John Bennet is a people pleaser. So I think he would I think he would get married.
Okay.
But I also think that there would be, being male and being the oldest, there would be like some natural responsibilities, I guess, that would change his demeanor a little bit more, because there would be a lot more expectations on him in terms of learning how to manage the estate. I think the relationship between Mr. Bennet and John would be a lot different than the relationship between Mr. Bennet and Jane. Just because it is like, he has to teach him everything about it. He's expected to be able to take it over. He's expected to continue to carry it on well so that it's carried off. I think Mr. Bennet, a lot of Mr. Bennet's personality is kind of based on the fact that for decades now, he has 5 daughters, and he's like, yeah, like, doesn't really matter. Like, it's not going to my kids. I think if he had a son to pass it on to, it would be a little bit different.
He'd be more serious about it.
Yeah. And which would in turn, I think John Bennet would, especially with pleasing manners and goodwill, would absolutely take that on. But there would be both like a greater closeness, but also kind of like an expectation on John Bennet to do things right and carry on the family name and the property and everything like that. In which case, I do think he would get married. It would be like no, you have to have, like, you get married, you have sons, like, now you have to do it too.
Which of the kids do you think that Mrs. Bennet would be most obsessed with, like, him getting, like, who he marries?
I think she would be most obsessed with, I can't remember what name we get to, but I think she would be most obsessed with the youngest.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah. Just because I think Mr. Bennet would be a lot more obsessed with the oldest. So she would be like, and I'll take the youngest.
And well, that's a good point. And doesn't she, like, most identify with Lydia in the novel? Like, because, and she even gives her the name Lydia, which is like a more unusual name at that time. It's like a more romantic name, like Arabella, Isabella. Like, it's like they're going for more like non-strictly English, a bit more foreign sounding names as they would have been at the time. Mm-hmm. And yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. So I'm gonna do devil's advocate then. I'm gonna say, like, what if he doesn't get married? And I would say it's possible because he's not terribly romantic, actually. Jane in the book really, like, gets along with Mr. Bingley in that she's like, we finish each other's sandwiches type of, like,
yeah.
She's like, we both like the color green.
Yeah.
And he likes people, he likes getting along with people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
And
I
everyone
think,
likes getting along with a golden retriever. So
yeah. And I don't think he's like necessarily looking for like someone to have this like great love affair with. That Lydia is one of those people who wants to like be in love and be loved. Um, and I also think I think he does get affected by stress, very visibly. Like Jane gets ill like a number of times in the book, like primarily at the beginning, but when she gets wet, she gets ill. and, and then when she later when she goes to like live with the aunt and uncle in London for a while, and she's like really depressed and like writing those letters to Elizabeth. Like it's very obvious like the stress and like and fear of what other people think of her is affecting her. And so I think that could be stressful to John too. And he might be one of those people who like maybe gets married later in life.
mm-hmm.
Which also
worried about like finding like meeting that all those expectations, like kind of holding off because you're not at a perfect place to have a wife yet, kind of thing.
Yeah, picking the wrong person or offending someone in some way, or maybe even being afraid of imposing on a young woman, like a woman, presuming them to be in love with him when they're not. Because Jane goes where she's like, I can't, like, she's so afraid of coming on to Mr. Bingley, like, and showing that she actually likes him, that he thinks she doesn't like him at all. And where Mr. Darcy thinks she doesn't like him at all. And then Elizabeth has to explain everything that's going on. So I think there is like a scenario where he doesn't get married or doesn't get married till much later in life. But I could also, see him taking the role of like landowner really and like inheritor of the property really seriously. Because that's like also it's like I've got to put everything into the landowner. Okay, so next on our list, second oldest, we have Elizabeth, who I have as Edward Bennet. Just going with the E's. I tried to go with the same letters for these. So we're gonna get to one that I know you don't like. We'll talk about why I picked it when we get there. So Edward Bennet is the second brother of the Bennet family and the hero of the story, which also is going to play into an idea that I have for what Edward ends up doing with his life. You might say this is Team Edward. Little Twilight reference.
But there is not an eternal life situation for Edward. This Edward.
So he is the most enterprising of the family, as Elizabeth is like very clearly the most enterprising. And by that I mean Elizabeth goes to take care of her sisters like numerous times, and so Edward's going to be the same. Like she has a really good grasp on when Jane goes to the Bingleys and almost dies from getting wet, and Elizabeth is like, of the whole family, she's like, I've got to go check out and make sure like things are okay. And then later she's like, I have like a really bad sense about Lydia. I've got to go figure things out. And then even when Charlotte gets married to Mr. Collins, she's the one who's like, I'm gonna go visit them and see what's going on. And because she does all of those things, because she is taking that romantic lead role, she is moving the plot along. She is able to like change things for herself, change things for other people. That's what makes her the heroine in the book. So in this, if Edward Bennet is the hero, I think he's going to be doing some like interesting things. And it's I think there could be a marriage. I think could be some interesting like marriage plots to this as well. But I have one idea, which is that Edward Bennet becomes a soldier. And like, I think this might take him a little bit along a Captain Wentworth type line. But the idea is, so if Edward Bennet is the second son, he's not inheriting the estate. He's not inheriting nearly as much property or money as John is. But he might inherit enough to be sponsored to become a captain in the army or a midshipman in the Navy. you could also get that from other family members or other people who could essentially like sponsor you or donate so that you could get that, rather than you can always enlist in the army or the navy, but you're a the lowest level, like entry level type person, which was considered like a commoner's role, which again, these people are only poor in the realm of rich people. So that to
So
them, being a foot soldier or being like a an able seaman, like the lowest level
yeah,
of the Navy, like would not be viable.
yeah. So I also thought about a Bennett brother or two being in the military in some form, but I did not think of it for Edward.
It's
I'll reveal later when we get to
okay.
those ones. But um, in a little bit of my head, kind of taking the like romantic idea of it and like the furthering the plot, kind of going out there doing other things. I thought Edward might do something more along the lines of like traveling abroad and being like, I'm a surveyor. You know how people are randomly surveyors and it's like their life of adventure. And it's like, yeah, walking
Yeah.
in straight lines. But like, I thought it would be like, that's kind of where my mind went when I thought of like, what is he doing if he's like going out there and doing something different?
Yeah, that could be. I think when I think of Edward going into the armed forces in some regard, I think I was like just turning him into Captain Wentworth in my mind, like a more like a really like romantic, like one who's like rises up through the ranks. Obviously, he gets to
Mm-hmm.
captain, which is higher. Otherwise, you get to be admiral, which is great, but pretty high up there. You can make a lot of money. Make a little money. You could make a lot of money doing it. Um, so that was one that I had, but then I thought this, which I actually like better. He becomes an elected official. I think that Elizabeth slash Edward ingratiates himself with merchantmen because Elizabeth is really good at making friends with everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And she does have that personality where she's good at like figuring out what people are doing, what people need. I think that he could work his way up through customs and other trade official roles. And eventually, if he marries a woman with a title, he could get into the realm of parliament and eventually support the Great Reform Act of 1832.
There we go. All right. I'm sold.
Which expanded suffrage for people in Britain. Men, really, but it was a huge, they called it the Great Reform because it was happening early in the like late Regency, early Victorian period, when we're starting to see sort of like the end of like the Ancien, like in Britain, the Ancien regime. And they're starting to realize like we need to change things or else we could have our own revolt against the crown.
Yeah.
The 1830s and 40s are when people are having a lot of those revolutions across Europe. They have some versions of that in England too, but they also in England were very concerned about it and doing a lot of like legislation to avoid that. So this is also where I think that this is where the marriage plot I think could come in for Edward is who does he marry? And like maybe another like enterprising woman, and maybe he's like, maybe she's even like, could we get women to be able to vote? Like she's a little bit of like an Angelica Schuyler type, like, and he's like, maybe we'll work on it. And
give me like 90 years. It'll be fun.
Yeah, it's not gonna be that. Yeah, just a little bit. Just be patient. But I think like that could be like a really interesting sort of like political story that they could get into. And obviously, I think that is one of the ones I have in this lineup that diverges the most from Austen because she wasn't writing about strict politics of the time period. She has like social politics, but not like like she's not talking about actual like legislative acts that were passed. And so this might diverge a little too much from Austen's like setting a little bit.
Well, she also wasn't writing about men as the main characters, so
True.
It all does diverge.
That's true. And that's also, I think, something important to note here is like if you have male characters as your main character. It's like there are things you can write about that you can't write about if it's all female.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I did want to give a shout out to the nonfiction book Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire by Amanda Foreman, and the corresponding film, The
Also
Duchess.
starring Keira Knightley.
Also starring Keira Knightley. Which is about the Duchess of Devonshire, who in the late 18th century got heavily involved in British and French politics, and would have a lot of repercussions for like lots of 19th century changes in politics because of the male politicians that she supported, including the guy that she had an affair with, who became prime minister.
Oh, and I will note, because she and her friends liked to say things weird, she pronounced her name Georgiana.
Oh, you're right. You're right. Sorry.
Yeah. But I do love that it was like the rule on that is like she and her friends like to say things weird.
It is like, so that's a great part actually in Amanda Foreman's book, is where she's explaining their sort of unusual dialect that was restricted to like one family of people.
Yeah.
Where it's like no one else said Georgiana. It was just these people who said Georgiana. So I think that's an interesting one that talks a lot about the politics of the time period also that like Austen is living through and writing in, that serves as like background that never comes across in the page, but then if you learn some of the background and then go back and read some of her books, you can kind of like work in where some of it, where it's like affecting people. What kind of person is Edward? Yeah, I think we talked a bit about like what kind of woman would Edward marry? Do I think Edward could exist without getting married? Maybe. I think that Elizabeth Bennet is I think she tries not to be romantic, but she is romantic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there was like inherently in the character, there is the desire to have that. And so like I definitely think that there wouldn't necessarily be there wouldn't be like a pursuit necessarily of a specific type of woman, especially like being a second son and not having anything to inherit. I don't think Edward would go like wife hunting, especially like because he would have to have a job.
Mm-hmm.
But it would be like he would find someone like fun with personality.
Yeah,
and it would be a love story.
Yeah, and like they meet at like a party somewhere,
a salon,
or like a gambling den.
Yeah.
Which that's another thing from Amanda Foreman's book. You learn a lot about late 19th or late 18th century gambling habits and like how addicted to gambling so many people were. Which plays into, if you read Vanity Fair, which is set in the Regency period, a little bit of the Victorian period as well, but was written in the late Victorian period. So it's technically historical fiction. But they talk a lot about gambling at this time in there. And I had, until I like was reading those, I had no idea, like all they did was gamble, some of them. So. Okay, so now we get to Mary Bennet or Marcus Bennet. If there's another M name, Marcus is okay. He's the third brother of the Bennet family. Something to note about Mary in the book is that she's noted as having neither genius nor taste, and that she's the only plain one in the family. These are the words. I know, of both the omniscient narrator and then the second one, the only plain one in the family, that's sort of like repeated by Mrs. Bennet and some of the others in it. But I've like Mary Bennet is an interesting character. I think in the world of people who do like Austen expansion stories and sequels, which you can do because she's in the public domain, anyone can write about her characters and her novels. I I think a lot of writers gravitate towards Mary Bennet because they see her as maybe like the bookish one or something. But I think like if you look at like that, she has neither genius nor taste. And they say that she's very conceited. And
Yeah, it's
um
like not a looker and also kind of a bad personality.
yeah,
It's not like she's just shy. No, it is not really winning features at
she's
all.
really, yeah, they're like she's kind of rude to everyone. Like she's there's not too much to like about her. And so maybe it's that I think maybe some authors like feel sorry for her and they want to give her a new story. That's a whole different thing. But I think some people like do gather onto like, oh, like she's like the bookish one or like the nerdy one, and that's me, and I'm gonna write like, and
Yeah.
I'm like, give yourself more credit. You're better.
Yeah. I think we're all better than Mary Beth.
So that's like my background on Mary Bennet or Marcus Bennet in this case. But like if we're looking at a brother who has neither genius nor taste, is conceited, and is also plain, what does he end
Get
up?
out of here.
He's the third brother. What is he doing? So at this point, he's inheriting even less than the second, because we've got, so the first brother is inheriting everything. The second brother probably is definitely more charming. So he's attracting more gifts from people. And also just statistically inherits a little bit more. The third brother's inheriting even less. So there's a couple roles that this level of brother has in this typical society at this time. I was like, does he become a scholar? Does he like go to school, maybe become an academic of some sort? Maybe
you would need someone to be willing to pay for it.
Yep, that's the main thing, is like students needed sponsorship to attend a university, especially like Oxford or Cambridge. I don't think they have that
No.
in this
And
family.
like, yeah. And also like Mary wasn't even that good at the piano, right? It was like
Right.
she liked the piano, but she wasn't very good. So like what skills does Marcus Bennet have that really says, send this man to school? He's gonna really impress. I don't think like a family member or someone else is going to say, sure, let's pay for him to go to Oxford.
If you look at someone who through their skill famously did get money to go to school is like Percy Shelley. At the time that Austen is writing, like he had his family had money. They actually cut him off a number of times because they were so annoyed with him. And like I could do a whole
I can
other
see that.
I could do a whole other segment on Percy Shelley, and it's not going to be favorable. Um, but famously, because his poetry was so good and unique, and like he was a bit of an edgelord at the time too, so so other men liked rewarding an edgelord, someone who's pushing the boundaries of propriety and politics at the time. He did get money from people, and that's also how he attracts Lord Byron, who invites, takes him traveling, takes him to a lot of places he wouldn't have gotten into without that companionship. And it's through his through his like skill as a poet.
All right, continue.
I mean, he had a number of wives. So. He had 2 wives at once. I don't. But does Marcus Bennet have that?
No, zero Riz. Yeah, to me, what I could see Marcus becoming really is kind of a lesser whatever job Edward has. It's like if Edward becomes a politician, he'll be like a clerk for him. If
Okay.
Edward becomes a lawyer, working through Mrs. Bennet's family kind of thing, Marcus might be his, legal aid or whatever. I could see Marcus kind of getting the sibling benefit, but being a lesser of the job, whatever it is, just because he has neither genius nor taste. And it's really his siblings are going to be the people who take care of him and give him opportunities, because I don't think he's going to, like, his siblings all love him.
Mhm.
Like, none of them would have gotten rid of Mary.
I do think like Edward would do that like I do think Elizabeth would do that, like Edward would do that for Marcus.
Yeah. Or even maybe John would keep Marcus on as some sort of assistant manager kind of thing of the land. So I think Marcus would have a job. It just like wouldn't be super impressive. It would be background kind of work.
Yeah.
Maybe they'd keep a piano around for him. What would his instrument be if he's a man? Because do men play the piano?
Men play the piano. They wait. I was about to say, doesn't Mr. Churchill play the piano in
I think
Emma?
he sings.
But he sings. It's actually Jane Fairfax who's playing the piano.
Yeah. Someone plays the violin at some point. Right?
Maybe. It's in Austen, it's always the women who are playing it.
Right.
But men could definitely play the piano. Beethoven. He played the piano.
There were men who played the piano in the 19th century, can confirm.
Mozart played the piano.
No, only women have ever played the piano. Yeah. But yeah, like I think Marcus just kind of gets a tag along type job.
Yeah, I could see that. I was thinking of like, so Mrs. Bennet's father was an attorney. And so he didn't give her much of an inheritance for her marriage. And her heritage is like specifically looked down upon by various characters, and where they're like, oh, her dad was a lawyer. You know?
Like, you say that until you need a lawyer.
It's like they still had to like pass like a governing body test.
They had to read the law and
yeah.
whatnot.
They had to show up in a suit. Like I was like, maybe he could do something like Elizabeth's uncle, like, so maybe he does something like that.
Yeah.
But yes, that's kind of, I think it's kind of a similar idea. It's like they're kind of like taking on like a family trade.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So now we're gonna get into the fourth one, which
I'm mad about the name.
We can change it. So we have Kitty, or Catherine is her full name in the novel, and I said Cassian. And I'll tell you why. There's a specific reason why, which is I Googled Regency men's era names.
Oh,
and because I just wanted to see lists by letter of the alphabet, so that I could just like pick from them. And you know, there weren't a whole lot for K's, and I was thinking of Kitty and not Catherine at the time. So I got like Cassian, and I'm like, that's kind of similar to, like, I don't know, but what? But do you have a different one?
Yes. Also, going kind of back to when you were talking about the way their names were kind of pretty conventional until you get down to Lydia. I immediately went to Christopher, and it would just be Kit.
Oh, I like that a lot better. Yeah. Let's go
Christopher. And it's also, you're just taking off TY.
Yeah.
The same.
Let's go Christopher / Kit. And for what I was thinking, I was like, because, and especially and this happens in the novel, it also happens in the 2005 feature film of Pride and Prejudice. Kitty and Lydia are so tied at the hip as characters, and that I'm like, I think that they would be as brothers too. They're pretty close in age, and also because now they're the fourth and the fifth, so they're getting even less and less, less opportunity that is just handed to them. They are going to have to sort of like choose what they're going to do with their life. And so I have them kind of like tied together, but I wanted to hear your thoughts on Kit.
Because I feel like I have an epic redemption for
Kit,
that Kitty was not afforded. So I feel like if we're looking at it. And yes, I think the two youngest are totally tied at the hip, but at a younger age, because you suddenly have 5 sons, which I have one son and he's a year old, and I'm like, it's too much. Um, you have your fourth and fifth, and then they're just tied at the hip. They're mischief. They are breaking things. It is too much. I think at a young age, because you send off um, young boys to be midshipmen at like the age of like 13 at the
Yes,
oldest.
very young. Yeah.
So I think at that age, Mrs. Bennet says they are trouble. Goes to her brother and says, because she has like a weird, like the youngest, I can't be parted. She says, I need you to pay for Kit to go join the Navy. And they send Kit off to become a midshipman. And then he's kind of not, a part of the family because he's always gone being in the Navy. But he gets his Captain Wentworth. Like he has a complete transformation. He's away from his family. He has a completely different life. One of more adventure, hopefully not death in the Napoleonic Wars, but is able to come back and have established himself rather than just being the fourth brother of a family that doesn't have a ton of money, but is able to be super impressive in his own right.
I like that. What about Lydia though? Like, do you think?
Lydia, I feel like would, or do you want to introduce? You haven't named him yet.
Yeah. So I had them tied together. So I'm gonna I think it makes sense to like talk about them together. So
Yeah.
we'll go. Lydia becomes Lawrence Bennet, which I think makes sense. I considered Lewis, but I think Lawrence is a little bit more romantic than Lewis.
Yeah. Until you call them Larry. And then I'm like, I'm lost.
I think even back then they were already getting nicknamed Larry too. I don't think that's a recent nickname.
Okay.
Do you think that they both become midshipmen?
They could. I think that Mrs. Bennet would have said, like, I can't be parted from my youngest. He's not ready yet. And it's just kind of like he gets kept at home and is able to, like, just kind of like wreak havoc on everything.
Okay. Yeah. And the one thing I was looking at with these stories too is I don't want the male Bennet brothers to just adopt the characteristics of the people they end up with. Like, so I was like, I don't want him to just turn into
Wickham.
Yeah. And like, even though I think they are kind of really similar.
Yeah.
In how they make choices.
So they could both get sent off to be midshipmen, although that is more expensive. And that's asking a lot of like relatives to pay for their commissions. But like if that were to happen, then Lawrence would maybe be the one that like loves landing at port a little too much. Like it's like, oh man. Like we don't need to go in every like bawdy house at port, like but it is because they are, as like Kitty and Lydia are very much like silly girls, and they're very young in the story, like they haven't matured at all, despite the fact that they're like out in society. So it's kind of like, ugh, too young for this. But like the idea that like you're sending two essentially children, boys, like out into the world and be like, you're men now. I think there's like a good comparison there. So yeah, okay, yes. Now I've added Lawrence is also a midshipman.
Well, that's one option, but like as you're like, I'm like, I could also see though if Mrs. Bennet kept Lawrence at home and was like, he's not mature enough, he's not ready, like he really needs to be here with his mama, like then I could also see him getting married to a much older woman. Maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe a little like his mom.
Yeah. and potentially being more into like the idea, like marrying a much older woman. It's like, well, she was wealthy. So like I
Mhm.
did it. And then also because she's much older, it's also like he can go and be immature and do things. And it's like, what's she gonna do?
Right.
Um, yeah.
And I say that, and it's like it's not necessarily like a bad, like it's not like a necessarily bad scenario. It's like it could be, it's like she gets like a cute young
Yeah.
husband, like,
She has a sugar
and
baby.
yeah, and then he ends up like inheriting like her property.
Yeah.
Maybe comes out the wealthiest of all of them. Who knows? Well, thank you. I want to thank everyone for watching all the single men. What if the Bennett sisters were the Bennett brothers? And I hope that you will watch the other segments, amazing segments that are going on with Virtual Jane Con this weekend. Yeah, so with that, I think we will wrap up. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.